Poštovani gledatelji, povjesničari i ljubitelji povijesti, dobra vam večer. 80 godina prije Kristofora Kolumba, kineska dinastija Ming na putovanje Indijskim oceanom do Arapskog poluotoka i Istočne Afrike uputila je 7 velikih ekspedicija. Na prvo putovanje 1405. krenulo je 317 brodova sa 28.000 mornara. Kineski su brodovi bili i 4 puta duži od najvećih evropskih brodova onoga vremena. Kinezi su početkom 15. stoljeća bili tehnološki napredniji od zapadnjaka i da su htjeli, mogli su osvojiti područja i izvan vlastitoga prostora. Ipak, svijet su pokorili Evropljani. Bili su znatiželjniji, spremniji učiti, zagovornici mentaliteta i stražiji o svoj. Evropljani su imali i vrijednosti i mitove, pravosudne i političke strukture zbog kojih razmišljaju drugačije. U današnjoj trećoj povijesti govorit ćemo o 3 revolucije. Znanstvenoj, koja je oblikovala svijet u kojem živimo, kognitivnoj, koja je pomogla Sapiensu da pokori planet Zemlju, i agrarnoj, koja nas je iz društva nomada pretvorila u sjedilačko stanovništvo.
Sredinom 19. stoljeća otkriće neandertalskog čovjeka i istraživanja Charlesa Darwina zaokupila su maštu svijeta. Od tada do danas naša su se znanja iz paleoantropologije neizmjerno uvećala, a proučavanje porodice hominida svakih nekoliko godina donosi nova, zanimljiva otkrića. Znanstvenici se uglavnom slažu da je razvoj ljudske vrste usko povezan s afričkom velikom rasjednom dolinom, gdje nalazimo nekoliko vrsta australopiteka, naših prethodnika od prije 5 milijuna godina. Iz australopiteka se prije više od 2 milijuna godina razvija prvi predstavnik roda Homo habilis, koji živi istodobno kad i nekoliko vrsta australopiteka. Prije 1,8 milijuna godina pojavljuje se najdugovječniji predstavnik roda Homo erectus, čiji volumen mozga i visina pokazuju znatan napredak u odnosu na Homo habilisa. Homo erectus pokazuje već velike sličnosti s našom vrstom. Vješto izrađuje oruđe, koristi se vatrom, razvija napredne tehnike lova i gradi nastambe. Upravo se iz erectusa prije 300.000 godina razvio arhaični Homo sapiens, iz kojeg se prije oko 150.000 godina napokon razvio moderni Homo sapiens.
Gost večerašnje treće povijesti je Yuval Noa Harari, profesor na Hebrejskom sveučilištu u Jeruzalemu. Ja vam želim dobru večer.
Hello, it's good to be here.
Dr. Harari autor je svjetske uspješnice Sapiens, Kratka povijest čovječanstva, koja je prevedena na niz jezika. Yuval Harari završio je Hebrejsko sveučilište u Jeruzalemu, doktorirao je u Oxfordu na temama iz vojne povijesti srednjega vijeka, ali posljednjih se godina uglavnom bavi velikim povijesnim temama, naročito vezi između povijesti i biologije. I'm very pleased to have you here with us. Could I call it maybe a gossip? Would it be wrong to say that people gossip a lot and that is something very normal, even very important for Sapiens?
Yes, most of human communication, even today, is gossip. If you check what people talk about on the phone, in their emails, on the newspapers, in the radio, in television, it's mostly gossip. And it's very natural because human language, in a way, evolved for the purpose of gossiping, not for doing philosophy or mathematics or anything like that. Because basically, Homo sapiens, humans, our social animals, our survival and success depends on cooperation in groups. And in order to cooperate with other people, I need to know who they are they trustworthy, who are the friends, who are their enemies. So for people, social information is extremely important. And many scientists believe that human language evolved primarily in order to convey social information, which is what we call gossip.
Mm-hmm. So, but there were many years ago, there were many other species, not only sapiens. Does it mean that other human were not gossiping, or why are we special? Why in Krapina, not far from Zagreb here, there are no Neanderthals anymore, but there are very many sapiens living?
Well, it's true that up until about 10-20,000 years ago, planet Earth was home to many different species of humans. We are used to being the only human species. and we think it's natural that there is only one human species. But if we look at other animals, they usually come in many different species. Like you have bears, so you don't have just a single species of bears all over the world. You have polar bears and grizzly bears and brown bears and black bears. And similarly, up until not very long time ago, there were different species of humans. Like here in Croatia lived Neanderthals, whereas our ancestors, Homo sapiens, lived in East Africa. It was about 70,000 years ago that Homo sapiens spread out of East Africa and basically conquered the entire world, driving all the other human species to extinction.
In which way? Was that a peaceful process, or what do we know? Yeah.
We are not sure. I mean, the two main theories, it was either just competition for the same resources, like when Homo sapiens came to Croatia from East Africa, it competed with the local Neanderthals for the same resources, hunting the same animals, picking the same berries, the same mushrooms, and Homo sapiens was better at it, so the Neanderthals disappeared. Or another theory, which I think is probably more accurate, there was also direct violent clashes between sapiens and Neanderthals. When you look at how Homo sapiens, different groups of Homo sapiens behave towards each other, when there are small differences of skin color or religion, so just imagine what Homo sapiens would do to humans from a completely different species. Even though we do know that there were also some more peaceful encounters and even sexual relations. 4 years ago, scientists completed the Neanderthal Genome Project and discovered to their amazement that Europeans have Neanderthal genes even today. Up to 4% of the unique human genes of Europeans come from Neanderthal ancestors, which means that maybe 30, 40,000 years ago, perhaps here in Croatia, sapiens and Neanderthals not only had sex, but actually had children together, and people living today are the descendants of these children.
But nevertheless, we as sapiens came, as you said, from Africa. How was that going, you know, and how we were able actually to reach that far, to go all the way to Australia, and why do you think that that step to reach Australia was something you or one might compare to going to the moon, maybe?
Well, the unique thing about Homo sapiens is that it did not remain limited to a particular area of the world. Like the Neanderthals lived for hundreds of thousands of years only in Europe and the Middle East. In East Asia, there was a different human species, and no humans managed to cross the ocean and reach Australia or reach America. And then 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens came very quickly from Africa, overrunning Asia and Europe, and reaching Australia and America, crossing the ocean and crossing Siberia and the Bering Strait. And this was very, very unique. We actually don't have any animal that managed to settle the entire planet unless it underwent genetic mutations. For example, you have ants all over the world, but these are different ants. The ants in Australia are not the same as the ants in Europe. But sapiens is the same all over the place because we adapt not by changing our DNA and changing our body. We adapt by changing our culture, our tools, our social organization. And the key to that is our unique language.
Prije 70.000 godina počinje nezaustavljivo širenje Homo sapiensa iz Afrike. U svega 40.000 godina naseljava se u cijelu Europu i Aziju, pa čak i u Australiju, a prije 16.000 godina sapiensi su prešli Beringov tjesnac i počeli naseljavati Ameriku. Tijekom toga procesa širenja, sapiens se susreo s neandertalcima, koji su ubrzo nakon dolaska sapiensa u Europu i u Srednju Aziju izumrli prije oko 30.000 godina. Još ne znamo na koji je način sapiens odgovoran za nestanak neandertalaca, ali je činjenica da upravo u to vrijeme sapiens ostaje jedina ljudska vrsta na Zemlji. U periodu širenja sapiensa po svijetu dogodile su se iznimno važne promjene u njegovu djelovanju. Danas taj fenomen antropolozi nazivaju kognitivnom revolucijom. Naime, u tom razdoblju nalazimo ne samo vrhunske domete u materijalnoj kulturi, poput izrade plovila ili luka i strijele, već i dokaze za postojanje umjetničkih i religioznih potreba. Također, upotreba jezika sve je kompleksnija, a plemena Sapiensa se, unatoč nomadskom načinu života, koncentriraju u sve veće zajednice.
Many people would say that Sapiens is destroying ecological system and destroying nature all around. But was that characteristic for these early Sapiens when they, for instance, came to Australia?
Yes, certainly. The destruction of nature, of the ecosystem, is not something unique to the modern industrial societies. We find it already tens of thousands of years ago. The first Homo sapiens reached Australia about 45,000 years ago, and within a very short time, more than 90% of the big animals of Australia became extinct. Then sapiens reached America about 15,000 years ago, and about 70% of the large animals of America became extinct within about 2,000 years. Altogether, even before the agricultural revolution, even before sapiens planted the first wheat field, we have already drove to extinction half of the large terrestrial mammals of the planet. And ever since then, the level of destruction has just been going greater and greater.
But some of the animals were very lucky, quote unquote, for instance, cows or pigs or chicken. How come that we have so many of these animals, species today on this planet?
Yes, in purely biological terms, these animals like chickens or cows have been extremely successful thanks to Homo sapiens, because we domesticated them and spread them all over the world. Today, you have in the world about 50 million penguins. In comparison, you have 50 billion domesticated chickens. There are 1,000 chickens for every penguin. The domesticated chicken is probably the most successful bird that ever lived in the world. We have spread it and multiplied it, and the same happened with cows and pigs. But this is from a biological perspective. If you take the perspective of the individual animal, then you see a very different story, because the price of the domestication of these animals was a lot of suffering on the individual level for the individual chicken or individual cow. If you did this competition, like Olympic competition, of who is the most miserable creature that ever lived on the planet, I guess that the gold medal would go either to the pigs or to the chickens or to the cows, because we basically, after the agricultural revolution, and even more so today, we treat these animals as if they are just machines for the production of meat or milk or eggs. And we completely disregard their psychological and social needs.
Prije 12.000 godina, krajem ledenog doba i ulaskom u razdoblje holocena, stvorene su pretpostavke za drugu veliku revoluciju u povijesti čovječanstva, neolitičku revoluciju. Povoljne klimatske prilike uzrokovale su postupni prelazak sapiensa na sjedilački način života. Prve tragove pojave zemljoradnje nalazimo na Bliskom istoku, posebno na području plodnog polumjeseca, koji se prostire od Palestine do donje Mezopotamije. Cijeli taj proces nije tekao brzo, ali se u idućih 6 tisućljeća proširio po cijelom svijetu. Također, novi način života postupno je mijenjao i čovjekovo poimanje svijeta. Javljaju se prva naselja, a pojava lončarstva i posebno izum lončarskog kola utisnuli su trajan pečat na kulture neolitika. Razvoj stočarstva i domestikacija mnogih životinja, ponajprije koza, ovaca, goveda, svinja i peradi, donose novu dimenziju u čovjekov način života. U tom novom stanju sapiens prvi put unutar određenog društva raspolaže viškom hrane i vremena. Dolazi do postupne društvene stratifikacije i organizacije. Prije 5000 godina javljaju se prve politeističke religije i prvo pismo, a otkriće bakra i bronce uvodi svijet u metalno doba.
You also have a very interesting thesis that people who lived, or the way how we lived before the agrarian revolution, were probably healthier and, well, let's put it like that, less miserable than people after the agricultural revolution. So maybe if you could dwell on that a little bit.
Yes, we tend to think about the agricultural revolution as a big step forward for humankind, and it's certainly true that on the collective level, agriculture gave us a lot of power. Without agriculture, you could not build cities and kingdoms and empires and, palaces and cathedrals and temples. So in this sense, it was a big step forward. But again, if you adopt the viewpoint of the individual, you get a very different story. Of course, if you are a king or a queen or a priest, then life after agriculture is very good. You have a big palace, you have lots of servants, you have lots of food, this is very nice. But most people were not kings or priests. Most people were simple peasants. And the life of the simple peasant after the agricultural revolution was harder than the life of the hunter-gatherers before the agricultural revolution in several respects. First of all, you worked much harder. Our bodies and our minds evolved for millions of years in adaptation to living as hunter-gatherers, going to the woods to climb trees and pick apples, to look for mushrooms, to run after rabbits. This is the kind of life that our bodies and minds are adapted to. And now, after agricultural revolution, most people, what they do when they get up in the morning is you dig canals, you bring water from the river in buckets, you harvest the corn, you grind the corn. These are much more difficult tasks for the human body. You see it in skeletons from archaeological excavations, that suddenly people are shorter, people have many more deformities, many more diseases. And also it's much more boring. It's much more boring to just all day grind the corn or bring water from the river than to go to the wood and look for mushrooms. Even what people do today, most people, you work as a cashier in a supermarket for 10 hours just passing groceries and for payment. This is much more boring than to go to the wood to look for mushrooms. In addition, the diet became much worse for peasants. Hunter-gatherers before the agricultural revolution ate dozens of different species of animals, of plants, of mushrooms, of nuts, whatever, and they got all the nutrients, all the vitamins that they needed. In contrast, peasants, let's say a Chinese peasant in the Middle Ages, he or she basically ate just rice and rice and rice. And the vast majority of the nutrition was based on a single crop, which perhaps provided enough calories but did not provide a balanced diet with all the vitamins and minerals that the body needs. And on top of that, you also had many more diseases. Most of the human diseases actually come from domesticated animals. Even today, every year, you have a new epidemic of bird flu or swine flu. They come from the pigs, from the chickens. Before agriculture, people actually had very few infectious diseases. And the last problem that agriculture created was social inequality and exploitation. In small hunter-gatherer societies, there was very little room for the development of social hierarchies and exploitation. In contrast, once you had cities and kingdoms, you saw the creation of large hierarchies with very small elites exploiting everybody else.
But nevertheless, these elites were capable of creating a society and able to rule with tens of thousands and millions of subjects. Well, all you said sounds very logical, but why at certain point those who maybe still remembered how it was before the agrarian revolution didn't say, well, we had enough of this. Why don't we return as it used to be?
For several reasons. First of all, the agricultural revolution, it wasn't like an instantaneous event that one day the tribe gathers and has a voting who is in favor of moving to be farmers, and everybody vote, and within a year everybody is a farmer. It was a very long process. It took centuries of very small steps, and by the time you had cities and kingdoms, nobody remembered the previous way of life. Even if you wanted to go back, you had two big problems, actually three big problems. First of all, you didn't have the skills. You are now a farmer. In order to survive as a hunter-gatherer, it's not easy. If you don't learn the skills in your childhood and early life, you will never be able to do it. If the night took me and dropped me in a jungle, I would be dead within a week from eating a poisonous mushroom or bitten by a snake or something. So it's not easy to go back. Yeah. Secondly, you couldn't feed all the people from hunting and gathering. Agriculture did give people much more food, which led to demographic growth, and then you couldn't go back without most of the people dying from hunger. Today, there are 7 billion people in the world. At the time before the agricultural revolution, there were only 7 million. So you can't support all these people from agriculture. And lastly, agriculture created this very powerful social and political elite of the kings, the priests, the chiefs, and they had a good life, relatively, after the agricultural revolution. They didn't want to go back. Mm-hmm. So even if some peasants wanted to go back, the leaders of society would not have let them to change the social and economic structure in such a radical way.
Yeah, and so what Sapiens did, once we reached that level, once we created the cities, mm-hmm. how was it suddenly possible to, to create big states, big organisms? What do we have to believe in order to, to support such a big state or mechanism?
Well, this is perhaps the most important question in history, is trying to understand what enables large number of people to cooperate effectively. Because this is the real advantage Homo sapiens has over all the other animals. No other animal is capable of cooperating in such large numbers as Homo sapiens, and also in such a flexible way. You have ants and bees that create beehives and colonies where thousands of bees may cooperate, but they do so in a very rigid way. When there is a new opportunity or danger, they cannot change the social system. They cannot, for example, execute the queen and establish a republic of bees. It's impossible. And you have, of course, other social mammals, like the chimpanzees or the wolves, that can cooperate more flexibly than the ants and the bees, but they do so in very small numbers. Among chimpanzees, in order to cooperate with another chimpanzee, you need to know him or her intimately. The big question about Homo sapiens is how come we can create very flexible societies, kingdoms and empires and so forth, in which hundreds of thousands, millions of people cooperate. And the answer is our imagination. We can create...
So it's not enough to gossip only?
It's not enough to gossip, because the problem with gossip is you can gossip about 100 people, 200 people you can know intimately. But you cannot really know the millions of people who live together in Croatia or in the European Union. So how do you create such big cooperation? Here the secret is the imagination and fiction. You invent fictional stories, and as long as you manage to convince everybody to believe in the same fictions, everybody will obey the same laws, the same norms. This is something that only humans can do. For example, you can never convince a chimpanzee to give you a banana by promising him that after you die, you'll go to chimpanzee heaven and you will receive lots and lots of bananas for your good deeds. No chimpanzee will ever believe such a story and will ever be willing to give you a banana for such a story. But Homo sapiens does believe such stories. People do believe that, oh, okay, if I help to build this cathedral, or if I go on crusade and die, then after I die, I'll go to heaven. And this is the basis for all large-scale human cooperation. It's true not only in the religious field. It's if you even look at economic structures or political structures, you find the same phenomenon, that cooperation is based on fiction. Today, for example, our legal systems are based on this idea of human rights. But human rights is just a fiction, an invention of humans, just like God or heaven. The same way that God and heaven are stories that we invented, human rights also are not a biological reality. It's not that in the DNA of Homo sapiens you find the Declaration of Human Rights written in amino acids. And it's not a biological fact. It's only in the last few centuries that humans invented this story and began to believe in it. And once everybody believes in it, then you can create a legal system. And the same thing is happening in the economic sphere, for instance, with money.
Ideje o pravima čovjeka i svetosti ljudskog života nalazimo u velikom broju predmodernih i modernih religija. Međutim, ono što danas podrazumijevamo pod pojmom ljudska prava zapravo je zamisao stara tek 400 godina. Ideje renesanse i humanizma te iskustvo strašnih vjerskih sukoba iz 16. i 17. stoljeća prethodili su i snažno utjecali na pojavu filozofije liberalizma i ljudskih prava. Prvi je prirodna prava čovjeka definirao poznati britanski filozof John Locke, no tek će američka i francuska revolucija u 18. stoljeću ideje velikih prosvjetitelja poput Rousseaua, Montesquieua i Voltairea uvesti u sferu političkog u obliku deklaracije o pravima čovjeka i građanina i preambule američke deklaracije o neovisnosti. Na prosvjetiteljsku tradiciju nastavila se ideja o univerzalnosti ljudskih prava, čiji su glavni zagovornici bili Thomas Paine i John Stuart Mill. Na temelju tih općih ideja u 19. i 20. stoljeću javlja se cijeli niz organizacija koje se zauzimaju za građanska prava, prava žena i radnika ili za oslobođenje od vlasti. Nakon strašnih iskustava dvaju svjetskih ratova, 1948. nastaje najvažniji dokument o ljudskim pravima. Opća skupština Ujedinjenih naroda donosi opću deklaraciju o pravima čovjeka.
Money is probably the most successful fiction ever invented by humans. It has no value in itself, just as human rights are not a biological reality. So money is not a physical or biological reality. You cannot eat it, you cannot drink it, it has no value. But if everybody believes, if you have the bankers and the presidents and the kings tell you that this piece of paper is worth 10 bananas, and everybody believes the story, so you can go to a complete stranger, say in the market, give him this worthless piece of paper and get 10 bananas in exchange. This is again something that chimpanzees cannot do. They may exchange things. Okay, you'll give me a banana, I'll give you a coconut, this can work. But you give me a banana, I'll give you this piece of paper in exchange. No chimpanzee will be willing to do such a trade. Mm-hmm. And in this way, fiction and the ability to believe in fiction was the secret of our ability to create these large networks of cooperation.
Yeah, but if you say money, then we could say that the whole capitalist system or banks or companies that are all around are also fiction. Do we live in a fictional world then?
Yes, again, corporations, like you think about Google, or you think about Toyota, or about General Motors, these are just stories that we invented. It's not a physical reality. If you ask yourself, what is a corporation, like Google, then obviously it's not the product of the corporation. You can destroy all the products, say, of Toyota, all the cars, Toyota still exists. It's not the workers. You can fire all the workers, and still the company exists. It's not the buildings, the machinery. Some disaster might destroy all the factories, all the machinery. The company still exists. It has money. It can borrow money from the bank, and it can build new factories or hire new workers. So what are corporations? They are what lawyers call legal fictions. It is stories that we have invented 500 years ago. There were no corporations in the world. And then lawyers came up with this idea, let's imagine that there is such a thing as a corporation, as a limited liability company that can borrow money and can pay taxes and so on and so forth. And this story was so successful that corporations became the main economic players in the world. And we treat them as if they are real entities. But in fact, they are stories, very effective stories, that exist only in our common imagination.
Čovjek je životinja koja pregovara. Niti jedna druga ne čini to. Psi se ne cjenkaju za kosti. Tako je pisao otac moderne ekonomske znanosti Adam Smith. Doista, sredstva razmjene stara su skoro kao i Sapiens sam, no tek se razvojem gradova i civilizacija pojavilo univerzalno sredstvo razmjene – novac. Prve kovanice nalazimo u Anatoliji u 7. stoljeću prije naše ere, a papirnati novac poznavala je već kineska dinastija Song u 11. stoljeću naše ere. Ipak, današnji svijet i sustav u kojem živimo zapravo je definiran tek u posljednjem tisućljeću, u kojem je Europa od prostora drugorazredne važnosti postala centar svijeta. Preteče u srednjovjekovnim gradovima, posebno u sjevernoj Italiji, a s velikim zemljopisnim otkrićima i pojavom apsolutističkih monarhija ušli smo u razdoblje predmodernog kapitalizma. Paralelno s razvojem kapitalističkog duha trajala je i znanstvena revolucija, koja je u svega 750 godina, između 1000. i 1750. postavila temelje moderne tehnologije i znanosti. Novovjekovlje nam je u nasljeđe ostavilo uistinu impresivne dosege, nevjerojatne tehničke izume, temelje svih modernih znanosti, suvremene političke teorije, ideje individualizma i intelektualnog vlasništva, ali i prve velike korporacije, poput istočno-indijske kompanije, prve ekonomske balone, čuvena tulipomanija u Nizozemskoj i strahovito nasljeđe kolonijalizma. U posljednjih 250 godina svjedočimo pak trećoj velikoj revoluciji u povijesti čovječanstva, onoj industrijskoj, kojoj se još ne nazire kraj. S dodatnim impulsom koji nam je dala informatička revolucija, pitanje je gdje je kraj mogućnostima Sapiensa.
I've started with the story of Chinese expedition all the way to Africa and the Arabian Peninsula at the beginning of 15th century. So obviously the Chinese were technologically better equipped than the Europeans. But nevertheless, we do not speak or we do not have Chinese as the official language, not at least everywhere in the United States, but there is English or French in some other parts of the world. So how come, what happened that something that was backward even, or at least at the very edge of the world, conquered the planet?
The European conquest of the world is one of the big surprises of history. When you look at the history of Europe for thousands of years, as you say, it was usually a backwater. Perhaps Greece and Italy were important, but what we today considered as the center of Europe, Western Europe, Germany and France and Britain, this was the Wild West, which was unimportant either economically or politically. There was never a big empire there. There was never any religion that came out of there. It was not important in technological or cultural ways. It was a kind of backwater to the center, which was in the Eastern Mediterranean, in what is today Greece, Turkey, the Middle East. And then suddenly, around 1500, this backwater area becomes the most vibrant and eventually the most powerful area in all the world, conquering the entire planet, and bringing its culture, its values, its languages all over the world. So today English became the dominant language in the world. And trying to explain the rise of Europe is one of the main questions of modern history. And frankly, I believe that we don't really have a good answer. It's still one of the big mysteries of history. Why Europe? And one of the things I like most about science is that when you don't know the answer to something, you don't have to invent some story. You can simply admit that we don't know. There are many questions, some very important questions in history, in biology, in physics, which we don't know the answer to. And the rise of Europe is one of these questions. Of course, we can say that Europe, and this is true, Europe conquered the world because in Europe happened the scientific revolution and the creation of the capitalist system. And science and capitalism are the two most powerful forces in modern history. But this only begs the question, why did the scientific revolution and the capitalist system, why were they born in Europe and not in the Muslim world or in China? And for that, we don't really have a good answer.
Is that cognitive dissonance maybe here, or not?
It's just, I think, recognizing the limits of what we know. Actually, this was one of maybe the biggest discovery of the scientific revolution was exactly this discovery of ignorance. Before the spread of modern science, almost all the major cultural traditions of humankind insisted on that they know everything. If you went to a priest or to a Jewish rabbi or to a Muslim cleric in the Middle Ages, he would tell you that we know everything. everything that is important to know about the world, we already know. It's written in the Bible, or in the Quran, or in Holy Scriptures. All the answers are in there. There is nothing that humans need to know and that we don't know. This was the main view of most religions. And what was amazing about modern science, that it started admitting ignorance. Scientists began saying, no, there are very important questions which we don't have the answers for, neither in the Quran nor in the Bible, no, anywhere. Nobody knows the answer to these questions. We still need to investigate. We still need to research. This is why modern science began to give more importance to observation than to learning ancient traditions. As long as you thought that all the answers are in the Bible, then what was the point of going exploring the world? Because it's much easier just to read the Bible. But once you realize, no, not all the answers are in the Bible, then I need new knowledge. Where can I get new knowledge from? I must go and do experiments, do exploration of the world. Maybe I'll get answers to these questions from observing the world.
But one can be maybe curious and interested in discovering new things, but doesn't necessarily have to conquer other parts of the world. So Europeans were not only exploring, but also, taking possessions around the world.
Yes, another very important development of modern history is, as you say, that in modern history we see a fusion of science and empire, scientific exploration and imperialistic conquest. Today we think that science is good and empire is bad, but for most of the modern age, science and empire were two sides of the same coin. Almost every scientific expedition that left Europe to explore the world was also a conquest expedition, and vice versa. When Europeans went to conquer other territories, they almost always brought scientists to explore the new areas. For example, when Napoleon invaded Egypt, he took not only soldiers, but also about 200 scientists to explore the geography, the history, the culture, and so forth of Egypt. Similarly, few people know that, but Charles Darwin I think everybody knows that Charles Darwin went on this expedition to the Galapagos Islands, and this is what gave him the ideas that eventually were formulated as the theory of evolution. What people don't know often is that this expedition to the Galapagos Island was a military expedition which was organized and financed by the British Navy. It was a ship of the British Navy, and the aim was to map the coasts of South America in preparation for a future war. So you see here, again, this combination of science and empire being two sides of the same coin.
And where are we heading? There are no empires as we used to know them, but there are some similar organizations maybe. And what's happening with science? How is science helping or maybe not helping us today? How do you see Sapiens in 50, 100 years?
Well, I think the next big revolution in history will be a revolution of humanity itself. Humans will use science and technology to upgrade themselves into a different kind of being, really into gods. We are in the process of turning ourselves into gods, of acquiring divine abilities. And I mean this literally, not as a metaphor. For example, in the book of Genesis, God creates animals and plants and humans according to his wishes. We are now acquiring with biotechnology this divine ability to create, to engineer microorganisms and plants and mammals and even ourselves. We are starting to genetically engineer ourselves. Just 3 or 4 years ago, I think it was Craig Venter, a very famous entrepreneur and scientist, who created the first completely synthetic life form. He and his team basically built an entire DNA of a microorganism that managed to live and to reproduce. It was completely engineered by humans. They even wrote the name of the company and the website on the internet of their company in amino acid inside the DNA of that microorganism. So theoretically, in 100 million years, if this microorganism would evolve to some intelligent life form, and this intelligent life form will be able to read its own DNA, it will find the name of its creator written inside its DNA. So we are basically acquiring these divine abilities. And I think it's very likely that in the next century or two, Homo sapiens will use such new technologies to upgrade ourselves, the same way we upgrade our computers and our mobile phones, will upgrade our body, our brain, our mind, and will create creatures that are much more different from us than we are different from Neanderthals or from chimpanzees.
And are we going to become immortal or immortal?
This is another divine ability which is now being more and more discussed. Perhaps the biggest project of the 21st century is going to be to try and overcome old age and death. Previously, this was the stuff of science fiction, but now it's becoming a much more serious scientific enterprise. The basic understanding of science is that death is not a metaphysical phenomenon. Death is a technical problem. Throughout history, people usually thought that death is a metaphysical phenomenon. Why do we die? Because God said so, or because the cosmos says so. And there is no way we can overcome death except with the help of some supernatural power. Like if Christ comes back to earth, then maybe we'll overcome death. But science now comes and says, no, death is just a technical problem. Why do people die? Because the heart stops pumping blood, or because some artery is blocked by fat. These are all technical problems. And according to science, every technical problem has a technical solution. We may not know the solution, but we are working on it. So more and more scientists and also business entrepreneurs are openly talking about the possibility of overcoming death and old age. Just 2 years ago, Google established a sub-company called Calico, whose declared aim is to overcome death. So this is no longer some science fiction. It's maybe the most important company in the world is saying, we take this very seriously. We are going to at least try and overcome death. Now, personally, I think it's very unlikely that in the next 50 years or 100 years, people will actually manage to overcome death. But I'm an historian. I'm not a biologist. I'm not really the authority to say if it's feasible or not. What I can say is that more and more scientists and business people are taking this very seriously. And even if they don't succeed, trying to overcome death will completely change our world. In the 20th century, you saw many people trying to create egalitarian societies in which there are no class divisions, in which everybody enjoy equal conditions. Now, as we all know, it didn't succeed. Yeah. Communism did not succeed in creating completely equal societies. But attempting to do that changed the world. Similarly, in the 21st century, we may not succeed in overcoming death, but trying to do so will completely change the world.
We started, and this show is called The Third History. You are a historian with PhD, medieval studies, but this sounds like biology a lot. Is that maybe a new wave in historical research or something else?
I think that history and biology are getting closer to one another these days. Basically, Homo sapiens is an animal, not different, I mean, of course, different from chimpanzees in many respects, but our bodies, our brains, are still the bodies and brains of animals. And I think that, of course, history and biology are different subjects, but historians can gain a lot from understanding the biological foundation of the human animal. And not only of our bodies and brains, but also of our ecological system. I think that many of the most important processes in history involve not only humans, but the connection between humans and other animals, between humans and plants, between humans and the ecological system. Again, this we'll see it in the 21st century, the impact of humanity on the ecology is becoming more and more far-reaching. And similarly, the impact of ecological change on history and the economy is becoming more and more significant. So I think that also when we look back, historians can gain a lot by having a good understanding not only of the economy and politics and culture, but also of the relations between human societies and the surrounding ecological system.
Dr. Harari, thank you very much for being with us here in Zagreb.
Thank you, it's been my pleasure.
Poštovani gledatelji, toliko u ovoj trećoj povijesti. Vidimo se sljedeći tjedan.